My name is Mark Hill. I'm with the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce, and we are co-sponsoring tonight's event with the Urban League of Middle Tennessee. And I want to also point out a couple members of our chamber team who are with us tonight. We have our president and CEO, Ralph Schultz, who is tonight. Ralph, thanks for joining us. Another member of our chamber team, many of you know, Etta Bell, who's around taking pictures and capturing this event for posterity. Etta, thank you for being here tonight. And just let me say, this is our 7th speaker series event as a chamber. We started this 3 years ago because we believe the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce has a role in promoting a community conversation about how we improve schools. And we have those conversations around what are the critical issues in education facing not only this community, but across the state and the country. And as we raise standards, how 100% of all students reach those standards is a critical conversation to have, and it's an important conversation that we're having tonight. So we're especially pleased because we get to partner with the Urban League of Middle Tennessee in this important event. So we're looking forward to hearing more from Michael later on this evening. We're looking forward to the conversation and the recommendations that are going to come out over the next couple days in this important conference. And thank you for involving the Nashville Chamber in this important event.
At this time, without further ado, I want to bring to you and thank personally Dr. MichaelNettles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. This initiative is part of a national effort by the National Urban League with sponsorship from the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to engage communities in more of the substantive aspects of reforming education in the country. This initiative was started last year and involves the states of Pennsylvania and Tennessee. Each of those two states has 4 affiliates. In Tennessee, they are located in Memphis, Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Nashville. And part of the process is to develop a strategy for addressing some of the national and state policy issues like Common Core state standards, teacher effectiveness, and other indicators of quality, rigorous curricula, and after-school learning, and what the National Urban League calls equity and excellence to scale. That means that when you see it, figure out how to scale it up so that it benefits more people. Well, the Educational Testing Service was part of the apparatus that instigated for this initiative. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has a long history of supporting the National Urban League and its education initiatives. And a couple years ago, Robin Ince, who is here, and Hal Smith were persuaded to take a look at some of these issues and begin to address them in communities. So one of our contributions at ETS to this initiative is to bring forth the data. We're having a conference for the next day and a half, and Patricia Stokes and I worked together over the past couple months talking about what we should try to cover. And these are some of the things that we discussed. We thought that the community should come together and rethink our goals for education. What is it that we want education to be in Nashville, and Knoxville, Memphis, and Chattanooga? And then we know that some of the proven methods for education work in some places, for educational reform work, but in many places they don't. So there's a great need, we think, for new ideas and innovation. And then we're going to ask the question of each other, how best do we engage the people who are here and the people who are not here? We need the whole community to be involved in the reform of education. And then we need to acknowledge that part of what we are facing in Nashville and in other urban areas is a long history of separation and division. And part of what we're trying to overcome is the remnants of the separation and division. Some of it is social, but some of it is also economic. And it's very difficult, and we need to figure out how to make progress. So I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about 5 things. One of the greatest influences upon our educational future is the changing demographics of the country, especially when we think about public schools. We also need to think about where we are in educational attainment and where we need to be. Some of these phrases are used just so that we become accustomed to using the same kind of language and distinguishing some of the concepts. I'm going to talk a little bit about educational performance, which is probably, not even probably, but it is definitely the most important aspect of the reform movement. That is our achievement and performance. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the consequence of attainment and preparation. And preparation here is used synonymously with performance. And then what we really need is some new ideas. Some of the ideas that we often hear and the rhetoric that we talk about are basically old ideas and experiences that we've had in the past, but we need to confront the fact that we're moving into constantly and even more rapidly these days into a new society all the time, and so we need new ideas and there's room for innovation. Okay, so the changing population of the country. By 2040, or sometime around the 2040s, the nation is expected to become majority minority. That is largely due to the growing population of Hispanics in the country. Hispanics represented about 15% of the nation's population during the first decade of this century. For the past 10 years. In 2040, Hispanics will probably represent about 35% or 40% of the nation's population. Now, and African Americans will continue to represent about 13%. That's what we are today, and that's what we're projected to represent in the future. So the country is really changing, and especially due to the growth in Hispanic population. Now, the effect of this is really that we can see a change here from 1972, and this is a regional profile of the change in student enrollment in public schools in the country. In the South, public schools have gone from being 70% white to 54% white. Part of that is due to the changing demographics, the growth in the black and Hispanic population over that time, but part of it is due to the exodus of white students from public schools, and you're experiencing that in Nashville. So one of the things you have to think about when I talk about innovative ideas, and you will hear some tomorrow, especially if you come to the luncheon talk where Chuck Wilbur will be giving a presentation about promise zones and the growth in the promise acts, like in the Kalamazoo promise. That's an innovative idea that we think will have a great impact on increasing the support and the interest that people have in public schools. So that, stay tuned till tomorrow. But that's one of the things that's going to change a lot more over the next few decades. Now, one of the difficult aspects of that we have to overcome in education is the difference in attainment. So I'm going to focus just a moment on this pie with the African American population. This indicates that African Americans, about 24% of the nation's African American population, have no high school diploma. About 30% have some college or an associate degree, and about 24% are high school graduates. Now, if you compare that with the white population of the country, it's very different. You get a smaller percent with no high school diploma, a greater percent with a bachelor's degree and a graduate and professional degree. So this is a profile that we need to work toward changing. If we were looking at this 20 years ago, we would find a similar story. what I'm suggesting to you is that we should commit ourselves to thinking about 20 years into the future and a different distribution in this pie. Now, the most important thing, I think, for us to do is to focus on performance and achievement. Now, this is a scatter plot of the National Assessment of Educational Progress results. This is an assessment. Most people think about testing in the schools in the context of the TCAP, the Tennessee State Test that all students must take when they're in the third grade. Well, there's a national assessment called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a random sample of students all over the country that gives us a sense of how the nation is performing relative to a really high standard. So this is probably the best test in the country. Okay, so it's a very expensive test. Some students in Tennessee take parts of it. No student takes the whole thing. A lot of magic is done to sort of represent the population of the country. But this is a really important barometer for us to know how we're performing. When No Child Left Behind was initiated, every state was required to take this assessment or participate in it in order to be qualified for Title I funding. Okay, so that was a major policy shift in the country. Now, what this basically shows is that this is a graph that shows the percent of the school that is African American. So over here, these schools, you see no dots, but this represents schools in the state that are African American, 100%, 90%, 80%. I'm going to explain to you why you see no dots over there in just a minute. These are the scores on the scale scores from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. The scale actually goes up to 500. Nobody reaches it. And it's a complicated story all in and of itself to explain how the test is constructed. But these students here are performing the best, okay? So now, these schools down here are predominantly white schools. The lighter dots on this graph represent the performance of white students in schools. The darker dots represent the performance of black students. This line is the average score for white students in the state of Tennessee in 4th grade mathematics. The bottom line is the average score for black students in Tennessee 4th grade in mathematics. The difference between these two lines is what we refer to commonly as achievement gap. So when you hear public officials talking about achievement gap, this is what they're talking about. This is the difference between these two lines. Now, the reason that we don't have dots over here is because in order to make this graph, the schools that are predominantly black needed to have 5 white students attending. This basically shows that in Tennessee, there's intense segregation in schools, okay? Now, I'm going to let Vera go to the next graph just to give you a sense of North Carolina. Okay, so North Carolina has been a progressive state in education, and you can see over here, these are schools that are 100% almost black, but they have white students in them. We didn't see that in the state of Tennessee at 4th grade. If you go to the next one, at 8th grade, you begin to see some activity over here, okay? So this is really telling us a big story about education in Tennessee. North Carolina is not in the bottom in education, Tennessee is. Go back, Vera, if you go back. I want to go back for just a second. Now, another thing to notice here is that this is 4th grade again, and this is mathematics. These are African American students in predominantly white schools. In no case in the National Assessment of Educational Progress do we see black students reaching the white mean. Okay, this is a huge problem for us. Okay, now But you see a lot of white students also approaching the African American mean. So what this basically says is that we've got lots of things to be concerned about in Tennessee. First of all, the segregation. We've got issues related to achievement. It's not necessarily black or white students, it's both, but a higher rate of African American students not achieving in 4th grade. Once we observe these gaps, we never see them change for the rest of time. So when we look at 8th grade, for example, as we're going to do in just a second, we're going to go back just a second. Okay, so this is 8th grade. Here we see some African American students approaching and actually achieving the white mean, and we see this is a big concern in Tennessee is middle school mathematics, and as well as other subjects, but especially mathematics. But we see a lot of African American students performing below the African American mean. Okay, so this is a big concern for us, and you see more cases the more African American the school becomes. Okay, so this is something to keep in mind. Now, another way to look at this gap, advance again, is to take a look at the long-term trend. There are several forms of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and one is called the long-term trend because it's important for us to see how we're doing over time. So this goes back to 1978 up to 2004, and these are 9, 13, and 17-year-olds. Now let's just look at the white students who are 9 years old. That's the gold line here. These are white students who are 13-year-olds, the gold line there, and white students who are 17-year-olds. Now, let's look at African American students. These are the darker lines. Here you can see the gap. This is the achievement gap between African Americans in mathematics at 9 years old. The difference between this line and this one. Now, what's very interesting and important for us to see is the convergence of these lines for African American 17-year-olds and white 13-year-olds. So what this basically tells us is that African American students are performing at a level at 17-year-olds comparable to white 13-year-olds on average. Another way to show achievement gap. And what we know is it's not due to ability or capacity. What we know is it has a lot to do with the educational process in our schools, and our activities in schools, our preparation for school, and a variety of other issues. Paul Barton, one of our colleagues, and Rich Coley, who you'll hear in the morning, have a report called Parsing the Achievement Gap, where they actually have found about 16 factors that if we give attention to them, we can close these gaps. Some of them are in school, some of them are out of school, some are even environmental, and some of them have a lot to do with the socioeconomic status that we have in our communities and homes that we also have to address. Another way to look at the data about school performance is dropout. Ralph Schultz and I served on the mayor's dropout committee when he was in his first year in office, and we struggled through a lot of issues. We looked at the range of dropout. Nashville has schools where practically every student graduates, and you know which schools I'm talking about. They're the selective public schools, but there are many schools where lots of kids don't complete, and we don't always know why. In the country, Education Week last year published some 2007 data showing that about 54% of African American students are dropping out. Now there are cases where in cities other than Nashville, larger cities, including Nashville. Nashville has a pretty high dropout rate. The case in Nashville is about 60% graduating, and in Memphis about 61%. Nashville is the 45th largest city. So I have the web link on that slide too, so if you actually put this into your browser at home, you can go and have a pretty good time understanding in greater detail what this looks like and how Nashville looks compared to the rest of the country. Now, the consequence of attainment and preparation. Part of the challenge that we face is converting from our psyche about school and how important it was in the past compared to how important it is today. 20 years ago, if you neglected homework and preparation and high achievement, the country and the workforce were much more forgiving than they are today, okay? So the higher rates of unemployment that we see among African American men is partly due to discrimination, but it's also due to the poor preparation and the poor quality of our schools, okay? So Anthony Carnevale, and I commend his work to you, he's at Georgetown University, has a report called Help Wanted, where he's projecting in 2018 the change in the reliance on college degrees. Okay, in 2018, Tony Carnevale suggests that people with college degrees are going to be rewarded a lot more for having the degree than they are today. Today, there's about a 74% differential in the average pay of people who have a bachelor's degree compared to a high school diploma. He's projecting that in 2018, that premium will go up to 93%, and then will continue to go up higher from there. This is why President Obama has the goal of increasing by 50% the number of college graduates in the country by 2020. The Lumina Foundation has a goal of increasing it by 60% by 2025. It's a very important set of goals. Now, we have to acknowledge that last week when we saw the government remain open and the bargain that the president struck with the Congress, part of what he had to give up was some concessions on Pell Grant. So we're going to have to find innovative ideas to finance education as well. Now, this is an interesting graph that I'd like to draw your attention to, and I'm going to use the African American bars to make the point. This is kind of a good news story. There is some good news. You know, more people are graduating from college than ever before. African Americans represent a higher percent of college enrollment than ever before. But one of the really good and important data that we are examining is the change in the expectation that students have for going to college and completing college degrees, okay? And this is really important. So in 1980, about 41% of African American high school students, when asked a series of questions about their future, expected to attain a college degree, a bachelor's degree. By 1990, that had increased to 59%. And in 2002, it's over 3/4 of the population. That's great. That's what we want. We want people to aspire and expect to go to college and complete college. And we actually are seeing evidence that they're following up on these expectations by applying to college and actually attending college. What's even better news is that half of that 77% of students indicate that they expect to take a degree beyond a baccalaureate degree. That means they plan to go to graduate school or first professional schools like law and medicine and so on. So that's a kind of a great news story. The challenge for us is to prepare them to fulfill those expectations. Now this is a difficult kind of a graph, but I think it's another important one. When students are actually pursuing colleges and universities, you know that they apply to a variety of colleges. And colleges and universities are segmented in a variety of ways. But one way we look at them is by their selectivity. Okay? So there are 71 colleges in the country that are considered to be the most selective. Okay? We have one in this town. We have one in Nashville. It's a private university. About a handful of those institutions in this 71 are public. The rest are private. There's also a class of institutions called highly competitive, another 107 institutions. When we observe the affirmative action cases during the early part of this century at the University of Michigan and other states, and we saw the case go to the Supreme Court, most of that was about this 107 and 71 institutions, okay? These are the two categories of colleges and universities where affirmative action is really intense. And part of the reason for that is because if you look at the African American enrollment distributed by selectivity of colleges and universities, you find that African Americans now represent about 11.5% of the nation's first-time full-time freshmen in college. That is wonderful. It's not where we need to be. We need to be about 14%. Then we would represent our population. We would reflect our population in first-time full-time enrollment. So we still have a way to go, but this is as high as it's ever been. Now, when you look at the representation in the most competitive colleges and universities, we are 6.4%. And in this highly competitive colleges and universities, we are 5.7%. Even in the very competitive, 5.6%. In the less competitive colleges and universities, and the non-competitive four-year colleges and universities, we are overrepresented. The good news is that there's a college or university available, even still, right? And you hear a lot of conversation in the legislature where Representative Cooper works about eliminating remedial education, not paying for an education in college that was paid for in elementary and secondary school. This is one of the issues that we really have to confront, and that is the growing need for higher quality preparation in elementary and secondary schools so that we can get these numbers up, especially in the selective colleges and universities. If you look at the Asian American population, the story is just the opposite. 6.4% representation overall, but 15.3% in the most competitive colleges and universities, and 11.9% in the highly competitive. Okay? Okay. So we need new ideas for investing in education and for changing our condition in the population. Last weekend, Hal Smith, the Robin's boss and my client, sent us an email. He had observed our new Commissioner of Education, Kevin Huffman. I've not met him yet, but he made this comment. He says, I think when our schools are failing students, and failing poor students in particular, we shouldn't take any option off the table. Now, I don't know how many people in this room saw this, but this is particularly important. Somebody should be calling him with ideas. Okay, so we really, that's what the community engagement part of the Partnership for Equity and Excellence means. When we see something like this, we need to have ideas about how to respond to him. And we have some ideas to talk about tomorrow in this conference. Now, so part of the new reality that we're facing that should buttress our new ideas should be the fact that no longer in the country Does the nation have the luxury of educating only a small fraction of the population? In order to sustain our economy and to grow the democracy and to sustain the standard of living and to remain globally competitive, everybody is needed. Okay? That is why the last president called it No Child Left Behind. It is a very serious matter. Everybody counts, and even in assessments now, everybody is counted in the assessments. That reflects our need to cultivate the entire population and not just a small one. So the nation has been able to survive and even thrive in the past. We've become a wealthy, wonderful country, recognizing that only a small fraction of the population were being educated at the highest quality. The jobs that you see today, and many of us have jobs today, where education and more education is going to be important to attain them and to sustain them in the next generation. A great part of the nation's growth is immigrants who are coming to the country without high quality of education, and they're also very often ELL students, but even the people who are native to this country very often are still first generation in their family to achieve higher levels of education. So our current policy rhetoric in the country includes some of these phrases. Now, what I'm suggesting to you is that we probably need to pay attention to these, but some of them may be red herrings to us, okay? So look out. So teacher quality and effectiveness, that's a very important concept that we'll all carry, and we very often when people are talking about it, they mean different things, so it's very important to engage in conversations with people to understand and make sure that you're talking about the same thing. Rewarding performance, that is rewarding teachers for their performance very often, and in some places in the country, rewarding students for performance. Common Core state standards and assessments. In the past, the country has had 50 sets of standards. Each state developed its own. Now the country has moved toward a common set of standards. Not every state has adopted them. Some states have opted not to participate. Texas is one, for example, a huge state that has decided not to adopt or to participate in the Common Core state standards movement. The next generation assessments. Many people have criticized standardized tests, and people are rethinking how we measure student performance and change in performance. International benchmarking. This is the country being concerned about our performance on tests relative to other countries that we consider to be competitors. Charter schools is a big deal here in Tennessee, and I'm going to suggest to you that we learn about charter schools, participate in the conversations about charter schools. Different parts of our state have received them with different levels of interest. In Knoxville, there's only one charter school. In Memphis, there are several. I think even in Knoxville, there's a charter school that was started by the previous governor. It's a math and science school. But most people in Knoxville or the general public seems to be opposed to charter schools. Now, charter schools are public schools, and it's important to figure out what they are. The evidence that we have to this point is that they perform no better than the public schools overall. Readiness for college and work, very important for us. And of course, the President Obama's goal of 50% of increasing by 50%. 27% of the country now has a baccalaureate degree and 10% an associate's degree. So that's about 37%. What President Obama is talking about in the Lumina Foundation is moving our population to where 60% of the population has either an associate or bachelor's degree. That's a huge goal. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that we also think as we're talking in public debate and as we engage the conversation, yes, we should talk about charter schools, and we should talk about new schools, and we should talk about teacher supply from different sources, but we also need to recognize that we have existing schools that need to be strengthened. Tomorrow afternoon, you're going to hear a presentation by David Chiara, who's the president of the Education Law Center, and he's going to talk to you about how we need to take a second look at school funding. He's going to suggest to you that the way people talk to us about it today, by talking about per pupil expenditures, is not exactly the way we should be talking about it. We should take a look at the inequities in state funding formulas, because there are different levels of need based on the socioeconomic status of populations. We need to strengthen our focus, just as we're doing with the Equity and Excellence Partnership, and sustain our focus on education. Very often, if you turn on the television and you watch school board meetings, there's very little time after dealing with cafeteria issues and bus issues and other kinds of budgetary issues to sustain the conversation about education, about mathematics, about writing and reading, about the content of education. Tomorrow you're going to hear about promise zones from Chuck Wilbur, and I'm going to suggest to you that the Kalamazoo Promise represents an innovative idea for reforming education. In 2005, a couple of families in Kalamazoo, Michigan committed $250 million to the school district in Kalamazoo. This was a town that had closed down the Upjohn Corporation and started seeing the population leave the city. That was in 2005, only 6 years ago. Since that time, what they've seen is dropout rates decline after this promise of college tuition was made. They've seen graduation rates increase. They've seen people from the suburbs move into the city. They've seen people from other states move into the city. The consequence is that property taxes go up, property tax collections increase. We need to think about a strategy in Nashville, in Chattanooga, Memphis, and Knoxville for doing this. Representative Cooper has passed a bill in the legislature to conduct on a trial basis promise zones in Memphis and Knoxville, and she's interested in expanding that. Tomorrow we're going to hear about fiscal equity, and we need to pay attention to how our schools are funded and demand the level of funding that we need to carry out. And we also need to think about what Ed Gordon is going to talk about on Saturday morning. He's going to be Skyped in. Ed Gordon is 89 years old. He'll be 90 years old in June 13th. And he's going to be Skyped in to the St. James Church on Saturday morning, where we will be meeting, and he's going to talk about comprehensive education. This includes things like the Harlem Children's Zone and the neighborhood programs that we see emerging in the country. So a call to action. I think there are three things that we need to get ourselves started with. First of all, we need to acknowledge the condition that we have and the consequence of the condition. We need to recognize where we are as a place to start from. We need to set goals from where we start. And then we need to respond to the challenge presented by the Commissioner of Education and other leaders in the state of Tennessee. And as you heard Mayor Dean talk earlier about how important education was. He started this meeting off tonight talking about how valuable education is for our city. And then we need to develop a plan of action for continuous and sustained progress. So I invite you to join us for the rest of this conference. I really appreciate the invitation, Patricia, to open it up with these remarks, and I look forward to the conversation here and for the next 2 days. Thank you very much.
Michael has done a marvelous job of framing the discussion that we will have over the next 2.5 days. And as you hopefully gathered from his discussion or his presentation, we have a lot of work to do. I mean, and that's putting it mildly. We have a lot of work to do, and that's what stays on my heart. Because when I look at the Chamber's report cards and I see that those students that are not performing are African American students by and large, students with English as a second language and special needs students, those are my children. And I think as a community we have a responsibility to learn what we need to learn about the move to Common Core, what that means for our children, and what that means for us as their advocates and as their teachers. So I encourage you also to continue with us through this process of at least getting started with the conversation. So are there any questions?
What is it, you said that that there's different ways to think about it and different ways to view it, and we need to understand what is going on. But a lot of the stuff that's coming down the media, it just says teacher quality. So what does that mean, and how are we going to measure that based on one test score, or is it still being measured off of that TCAP score?
Yep. So that's a very good question, and so the question has to do with how we think about teacher quality and what people mean by it. And I would invite you to sort of suggest how you view it in the context of your own local school, because very often people have a sense that if their children are in school, they're being loved and cared for, that's sufficient. But I think what the public policy commitment is toward subjects like mathematics, achievement, and using, as you suggested, TCAP scores to measure it, okay, to measure teacher performance. In the state of Tennessee, we have the value-added assessment program where teachers are rewarded on the basis of performance and growth on the test. So that's the sort of official definition of it. Now the question is, how do you change the condition? Because we recognize that regardless of what the tests show, that there's a continuum of quality of teachers. Well, one way is to ensure that teachers are prepared well before they start, right, teaching. So we need to get the colleges and universities involved in ensuring that the teachers are prepared well. And then, in many cases, we need to figure out how to ensure that the teachers who are working have the support they need in the school to do well, right, and continue to develop themselves.
There's equity across the board in that.
Yes, so that there's equity, because very often when we talk about the reward programs like the value added, and you look at who's getting the rewards, there's very often a disproportionately low number of teachers who are African American who are receiving the rewards. The same way with the rewards associated with passing the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards test, which in many states are rewarding teachers for going through that process. It's a long-winded response, but yeah, thank you.
How do we get the teachers to perform when they are being evaluated unevenly? Because there isn't any way that you can even up the classroom situation in any school, and yet we try to evaluate who is a good teacher and who is not doing a good job when you've got one group with quality students as we define it, and then we've got another group without it. What are you going to do in order to be certain that good teachers who take on not good students are not penalized because they agreed to work where they are needed the most, rather than rewarding the ones who get into the good situations, and of course the students make them look good. Do you have an answer for trying to equalize that evaluation?
Yeah. So your comment was excellent as well as your question. I'm almost inclined to suggest that you answer the question, because the way you stated it suggests to me that you probably got some ideas. And that's what I mean by innovative ideas. We recognized early in the process of having these colleges and universities work with elementary schools that the teachers were ignoring the rewards approach because they felt like they weren't going to have a fair chance to compete for precisely the reason that you suggested. So what I'm going to suggest to you is a strategy where you pay some teachers up front, which is what we're doing in that project. And what we're learning from that is that we're getting a lot of engagement and participation from the teachers, okay? So for many teachers in the system, the reward for performance of their students may be a good incentive. For some teachers in the system will feel hopeless because of the reasons that you stated. So I think that when the proposals are made for the rewards, for rewarding teachers, you need to come forward with a proposal to suggest that perhaps that's half good for the system, but maybe that needs to be counterbalanced with an approach where you actually pay some teachers up front for their participation, even if it's less. In our case, we're paying teachers $3,600 more a year. The rewards type programs are usually for $10,000 a year, but I think we need a bit of both in order to be successful. That's my suggestion, but you may have another one.
What is the data saying on one-sex schools, particularly inner-city all-black male schools? What's the data saying around that?
Okay, so the question is, what evidence do we have about single-sex schools? The limited evidence that I know about comes from New York City. We had a conference in Princeton at ETS in November focusing on African American males. And we're going to have another symposium in June, on June 13th and 14th in Washington, D.C., that focuses on African American boys from birth to age 9. We're going to suggest that if the country pays attention to that population and introduces interventions now, that we can perhaps change the trend of data that we see on incarceration, on higher rates of unemployment in 20 years, 15 to 20 years from now. And also that population represents about 2.8 million people if you think about people who are identified as black alone, but only 3.5 million if you consider the people who are African American but maybe have a mixed race, for example. So 3.5 million, we actually know where they live. So we have plotted them into congressional districts. So we're actually working with the Children's Defense Fund to suggest that we have multiple strategies. One of the strategies may be single-sex schools for young people, especially middle school and elementary school. In some states, it's not legal, like in New Jersey, it's not. But the evidence that we have from some schools in New York City is that they are actually working. The Eagle Academy for Boys is one of them, for example. And there are a variety of now, in the private sector, even in Nashville, there are single-sex schools, okay, MBA, Harpeth Hall, St. Cecilia. And people have different points of view about them. I happen to think that for some people, they're great, and they should be an option, okay? So I'm not sure what the law is in Tennessee. Does it support single-sex schools in the public sector in Nashville?
You can have a charter school
Alan Cupstone says nothing for or against.
Yeah. So the final answer to your question is because you asked for data. You didn't ask for me to preach about the quality. So the data are anecdotal for the most part, but you know, people who have subscribed to them have enough evidence that suggests that they might be, they should be given a try, just as charter schools are. Thank you.
I'm going to encourage everyone to continue with this conversation over the next day and a half. The time has come for us to close out this evening. So once again, let's thank Michael Nettles.
Thank you.